I wish to begin my remarks by recognizing that Saskatchewan was founded on the territories representing the formal agreements made between the Crown and First Nations and numbered treaties 2, 4, 5, 6, and 8, and 10. Tragically, those treaties were not honoured with the spirit and intent with which they were entered. As a descendant of white settlers and an MLA, I am committed to righting the wrongs of the past through the implementation of the 94 calls to action arising from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the 231 calls to justice contained in the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Mr. Deputy Speaker, every day I am so grateful for the opportunity to serve in the Saskatchewan Legislature on behalf of the people of my constituency in Saskatoon-Nutana. I carry with me their hopes, dreams, and aspirations for their families and their futures in a just, kind, and caring society that invests in its people and its institutions for the betterment of all. It is a solemn duty that I couldn't carry out without the love and support of my family and the able assistance of my constituency assistant team. I've lost the... we're good now? Okay. Pardon me, I'll get back into it. I was just saying that I wouldn't be able to do this work without the constituency assistance team, and in particular, Carrie Schaefer. She has been indispensable this past year as we've worked to establish our office, understand our roles, and find creative ways of remaining accessible to the people I represent while staying safe and socially distanced throughout the pandemic. In that time, I have been ever mindful that the role of an elected official is a sacred trust, one that can profoundly affect the lives of the people we are called to serve. This past year has illustrated that relationship in the starkest of terms, as we've witnessed how our government's disastrous decisions and choices have set our course through the pandemic and determined its outcomes, with the worst performance of all the provinces in COVID cases and death rates. According to a recent Angus Reid poll, fully 64% of Saskatchewan people feel that the Sask Party government has failed to handle the pandemic, a clear indication that sacred trust has been irrevocably broken. In our time of greatest need, our Premier, his Cabinet and caucus let us down. They've lost our confidence and left us demanding to know why they refused to act decisively and courageously in the best interests of every Saskatchewan person. It is unconscionable that a leader and government would act with such hubris and recklessness in the face of such grave circumstances. On top of my great sadness and anger for the suffering and anguish they have caused, I can only conclude they are not fit to lead. This government has shown themselves to be entirely out of touch with reality, tone deaf to the suffering, refusing to course correct with targeted public health measures when all indicators pointed to an impending health care crisis, and instead chose to ignore the calls of reasonable and qualified experts. What causes a government to ignore the science so flagrantly, to think they know better than the experts, or decide that the risks to human health and life are a fair bargain? Can they not tell the difference between sound advice and uninformed opinions? What could justify the disproportionate cost in human misery, suffering, and death? And how could any government take such a gamble? I can only conclude that this government willfully chose to ignore the advice of their own officials to implement public health measures, even though they knew the dire consequences, where hundreds would become infected and die, and our health care system would be brought to the brink of disaster, leaving many without access to health care as their surgeries and other services were cancelled and postponed. Earlier today, our leader of the official opposition spoke on behalf of a family from my constituency, Laura Weens and Graham Dixon, whose baby daughter Helen has not received the diagnostic care and surgeries she requires to assess her prognosis of cerebral palsy. Every day of delay in her diagnosis and treatment will set the course for her future quality of life, as windows of opportunity are missed to deliver that health care. Not only Helen, but so many more constituents in my community of Saskatoon-Nutana have come forward with their stories. A constituent whose mother's heart condition, brother's knee replacement, and nephew's kidney transplant were all delayed. A mother whose elementary-age son is asthmatic and is fearful that if he gets ill, he won't receive the treatment, as a pediatric ICU is full of adult patients. A granddaughter concerned about her elderly grandmother, who, as the hospital was so short-staffed that her family had to feed her and didn't discover her arm was broken until 54 hours after her fall, and has received substandard care. A young 30-year-old woman and cancer survivor who needs an MRI. Another constituent whose skin care surgery has been cancelled. A constituent who can't get medical care for a kidney stone. Another woman with breast implant disease whose surgery referral was delayed. Constituents affected by the surgery backlog for hip and knee replacements. A father whose collapsed lung waited a week before he was admitted to hospital. And I often am hearing from Saskatchewan citizens residing outside my constituency and, that belong on the opposition side, including a woman whose mother has had her cancer diagnostic testing delayed indefinitely. These cases are heartbreaking, and I could go on and on. There are more than 35,000 surgeries that have been delayed since the pandemic began, and counting. For a province whose identity and prosperity is so closely linked with its proud legacy of universal public health care as a basic human right, this is unforgivable. Saskatchewan people have counted on their public health care system to be there for them for over 50 years. And after years of leaning the system down to the bone, they've now delivered the final blow from which it may never recover. So much for the birthplace of Medicare. The Sask Party government has kicked quality, publicly funded and delivered health care to the curb. When this government decided to remove all public health care restrictions on July 11th, with the full knowledge and warnings of public health officials, they were making a clear choice to put politics ahead of people. I can't begin to understand how a duly elected representative could rationalize such a decision as sound or just. It displays a total inability to think critically or unbiased, which are the hallmarks of good governance in a modern democracy. It's not a proud moment for our province when we've drawn international attention, not for being the bastion of universal health care, but because of this government's failed leadership during these trying times. This reckless, simple-mindedness and incoherent thinking is especially dangerous in contemporary society. Increasingly, we live in a VUCA world, one that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, all at the same time. Leading under such conditions involves doing the hard thing, not what is ideologically driven or politically expedient. We saw this occur in other provinces, even those with conservative leaders. Objectively, it is fair to say that Saskatchewan's government has led the worst pandemic recovery in Canada due to its failure to recognize and respond to what was playing out before them. The Premier told us repeatedly that it wouldn't be fair to those who were already vaccinated to impose public health measures. And yet we saw how quickly proof of vaccination and masking was able to bend the curve once he ultimately acquiesced after months, not weeks, of ignoring the advice of medical experts. How was it fair to allow COVID cases to rise unchecked to the point that the health care services had to be denied to those in urgent need of care for their cancer surgeries and other non-COVID related services? Whose rights were ultimately denied? We've all paid the price in the end, but most of all, those who are most vulnerable and powerless. What's not fair is that our Premier chose to protect the interests of a few to the detriment of the many. What's not fair is that he chose to make incoherent arguments and misrepresent the truth. What's not fair is that his actions have caused the pandemic to spiral out of control, imposing an unfair burden on workers in healthcare, education, and the service sector for months on end. How is that fair? Where is the justice in that? And where is the humanity? Honestly, why has no other minister around that cabinet table had the decency or courage to stand up and refute such nonsense? What does that say about the cabinet leadership, all those advising the Premier and the Health Minister, or the Premier himself? Does the Emperor have no clothes? Is his cabinet filled with yes men who are too afraid to challenge him? Or does he rule with such an iron fist that dissent is disallowed? These are honest and sincere questions. How deep is the rot in this government that our Chief Medical Health Officer's recommendations can go unheeded so dispassionately for months on end, to the point where he is reduced to tears and projects a fall and winter of misery? How callous and insensitive is this government cabinet and caucus? How could they let it come to this? In the past several months, I have heard from many people who are filled with regret for putting their trust in a leader and a government who's offered nothing more than being strong. Honestly, what does that even mean? This isn't the Middle Ages. Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan people are literally sick of the Sask Party government whose leaders offer nothing more than tough guy diplomacy. What's absent are the qualities of a true leader, ones that inspire people to follow them through challenging and uncertain times. Where is the compassion, empathy, and understanding for all those suffering? Where is the humility to listen and heed the advice of experts? These are matters of discernment and judgment, exercised by leaders who function free of bias, not a wannabe strongman. But the people are starting to see past the bravado. More and more, we hear people publicly questioning whether they can stand to stay in a province led by a leader who so stubbornly refuses to listen to experts, admit when he's been wrong, and instead misrepresents the truth and gaslights anyone who speaks out, let alone say he's sorry. Saskatchewan used to be a place where people flocked to in droves, inspired by its progressive ideals and policies. We were known as the innovators in social policy, sustainable resource development, promoting arts and culture, and public institutions that ensured local ownership, service delivery, and wealth distribution. We punched above our weight on the national scene. We're prudent fiscal managers while standing up for our provincial interests within Confederation. My goodness, look how far we have fallen after 14 years of Sask Party rule. Now instead, we are known for our backward policies that ignore gender inequities, systemic and structural racism, lax environmental laws, and the lowest COVID vax rate in Canada. We've become a dystopian state where up is down and black is white. Is it any wonder so many people across the province are planning their exodus? We have the highest COVID death rate in the country right now because of the refusal of this government to offer leadership and follow the science and the experts. And don't kid yourself, they have been using the same approach in every other area of government since they were elected. They have been playing fast and loose with our collective futures, striking sweetheart deals and taking crumbs in return. Where are the policies that strengthen worker protections, protect local businesses, ensure a healthy environment and a living wage for all workers? Ask yourself, who benefits when Moe attracts big money to Saskatchewan to extract resources, drain our wetlands, and cut down our forests for so little in return? They hoot and holler, Mr. Speaker, but when former NDP governments oversaw the development of natural resources in this province, we sought to strike a truly sustainable and fair deal for all, with innovations such as ensuring employment for residents of Saskatchewan's north, environmental quality councils that ensured communities had a voice at the table, and labour legislation that was leading edge in Canada. This wasn't greenwashing like this government is proposing through its Sustainable Saskatchewan brand. With them, it will be little more than lipstick on a pig. This government has set goals for doubling ag and resource investment, but with no obligations on developers to give back, and while favouring out-of-province profiteers. Our surface rights legislation is 50 years old. A decade ago, this government promised landowners they would revamp the legislation to protect their rights and ensure fair treatment for all. Why won't they support rural municipalities demanding that their tax arrears of over $19 million be paid up? For far too long, this government has taken for granted rural landowners. To highlight another pertinent example, one only has to look at the failed ag water management strategy overseen by the Water Security Agency. Here you have a government that today, as we speak, is allowing wetland habitat to be drained and plowed over while they turn a blind eye, refusing to enforce their own legislation. Trust me, you aren't kidding anyone with your greenwashing, and it's an absolute slap in the face to all those who are the true environmental stewards on the land. Make no mistake, this government has shown us who they truly represent. They have demonstrated that they lack the courage and the fortitude to act with integrity and do the right thing. If there's one thing that I've learned during this pandemic, it is that the Sask Party has only one playbook when it comes to governing. It doesn't matter if it's COVID, climate, or homelessness. This government denies and downplays the science, ignores the experts, gaslights the victims, and gives credence to disinformation that discounts, deflects, obfuscates, and downplays the reality of the true situation. Mr. Speaker, and to the broader Sask Party caucus, I want to say, you've let your constituents down. and broken that sacred trust through your inability to stand up to your leader and demand better. You can try to rewrite history, but no one will be buying your tired old lines, knowing your government has so epically failed to protect their health throughout this pandemic. You can try and change the channel as hard as you want, but the public won't be fooled. The people have lost faith in your government's leadership. They won't forget your failures or how you put politics before people and damage their families and their livelihoods. They won't be bought off with blatant and shameless tricks. With that, Mr. Speaker, I'll conclude my remarks. And let it be known that I will not be supporting the government's motion, and instead will be supporting the amendment put forward by the official opposition because it neither recognizes the COVID-19 crisis in our province nor proposes measures to address it, which is a direct result of the Sask Party government's choices that put politics ahead of Saskatchewan people, and that the Assembly has lost confidence in this government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.